So welcome. My name is Kate. Actually, I don't know most of you. So I'm a Tantra teacher here in Tara. And even if this topic might seem a little bit of a, you could say, diversion from what we teach in the Tantric path, so to speak, actually it's something which has inspired me incredibly also on the path, which I follow as a Tantric practitioner and a Tantra teacher. Our topic today, as you've seen, it's called Women in Ecstasy, and it's about female saints and sages. And here I want to start by defining what I mean when I say a saint, because there are some different interpretations of this word, and especially, for example, in the Christian tradition, it's very specific what it means in terms of someone being canonized and recognized by the church, for example. But here, what I mean when I say a saint, I mean somebody who has walked the spiritual path all the way to reach the state of union with God. So it's what we could call the state of enlightenment. So far as I'm aware, somebody who has walked the path, whichever path that is. And as we'll see, these spiritual paths, they actually have a lot in common. So even if the saints we will speak about come from some different spiritual traditions, I hope that you will see through this talk that actually they have very, very much in common, and all of these paths, they are actually merging, we could say, into one and all leading in the same direction. Now, I kind of started on this topic because for me, reading about the lives of saints and masters has been one of the most inspirational practices, I could say, that I've done on my spiritual path. It's something that has awakened in me time and time again this state of aspiration and the state of love for God, because somehow reading this in their lives and in their works, it's also, I find, awakening this in me, and it's something which is constantly inspiring me. And even in the different practices which they do, I always find inspiration also from my own path. And here I'm speaking about both male and female saints and of different traditions. So personally, I find whenever I read a book which is about the life of one of these saints or masters, the period of time that I'm reading, it's like my whole world gets transformed somehow by their life, and whether that be a Hindu saint or a Christian saint or a Sufi mystic or whatever it is, it's something I find when I have an open heart, it's easy to assimilate this from them, and that's why it's so inspiring for me. So that's somehow where I came from with looking at saints. But when I've been reading about different masters and saints, I discovered as well some feminine saints and some female ones. And I realized that actually their lives are quite often overlooked. Not that they weren't venerated or admired, but somehow they are not so prominent or in the foreground as some of the male ones. And that's why I felt to do a talk, because it would be nice to give them their place and to let their lives somehow shine and inspire us as much as possible. Now, obviously for me as a woman, they become role models because they are examples, we could say, of spiritual women and extremely inspirational ones. But in their lives, in their times, they were also great inspirers also for men. And from the Tantric point of view, we could say that they manifested what we call the power of Shakti, or this, we could say, connection with the divine feminine. And they were an initiating force, we could say, these women, meaning that they had this capacity to initiate both men and women in the spiritual path and in these ways of reaching God. And something which was, we could say, common to all of them is that they had this way to offer exactly what was needed to each and every one of their followers or disciples or those who came for advice or counsel. And this regardless of their background or religion and so on. So this is something very beautiful in the lives of these saints, is that they defied very much the conventions of their time, whether it be the religious conventions or social conventions, cultural conventions, and they somehow viewed all souls as equal, and they had the desire to help each and every person, and very often they got themselves into trouble also with their, say, the society they lived in or their religious authorities and so on, because of this approach that they had, which was not following, we could say, all the norms of the society and the religions that they lived within. It was actually quite a beautiful synchronicity for me that I decided to do this talk a long time ago, last year. And then actually when we were preparing one of our retreats, it's called the Polarity Retreat, which is, it happens in April and Easter, and when we were preparing this, one of my co-teachers actually came up with this idea, wow, wouldn't it be so nice within the retreat to teach about the female saints as an inspiration to the women, because we have some separate sessions which are just for women at that time. And so we did this in the retreat. We offered somehow some stories of the lives of the saints. And for me it was a very beautiful thing, because I hadn't said anything about planning this talk, and somehow one of the teachers, she came with the same idea, and this for me was a very beautiful sign that it's something which is needed and integrated for us. And also, I don't know if any of you are following our social media channels, but one thing that was very touching is that when the team here made a post on the Instagram channel about the saints with some pictures and some quotations, poetry from the saints, it's been one of the most popular social media posts on our page, despite there being a lot of others about very many different juicy topics, and including tantric ones. And this really showed, wow, this is something which people are really craving to feel, somehow this yearning and this search to find God and to learn, we can say, about people and about women who have this, were on this path and helped so many people to reach a very spiritual state, and both in their lifetimes and also beyond their lifetimes, because that's something as well which is very common to all of these saints, is that they inspired people well beyond their physical lifetime, we can say. Now, as we have quite a short amount of time for this talk, it will not be a biography of all the saints, so that would be a lot longer. We probably need the whole weekend to discuss all of their lives. I will give a little brief description of them in a moment. But rather, what I want to do in this talk is to look into some aspects that these saints have in common and how they walked this feminine path towards God, which is feminine, but also there's much in their lifetimes which, as I said before, both men and women can take from, and to see somehow what they were teaching and how they can inspire us. So I will try to draw some bits out of their lives and their practices. And you'll see in a moment when I will show you them, that they come from a range of countries, a range of spiritual traditions, and a range of time periods as well, because they were ranging from the 1st century CE, as it's now called, I think, and up until almost the present day. The last one died in 1982, so it's quite a range of time periods which we'll cover, but somehow, as I mentioned before, they all have very, very much in common. And we'll look into some of these and draw some parallels. And also we'll see some of the differences, because I do want to say that each one of these saints, this is something very obvious when you study their lives, they have their own unique personality, and they did walk paths which we could say were colourful and had some very different colours according to each one. So I don't want to put them all in one box and say they were all the same. But still there is this somehow common merging of their past. So let's look at some of the saints. Out of the way. This isn't, by the way, an exhaustive list of all the female saints that have ever lived, but it's some that I picked to focus upon, especially because they come from some different traditions sometimes. I didn't know what order to put them in, so they're in alphabetical order. Just so you know, I didn't know how to structure this, so I just chose a simple way to decide. So the first thing we have on the list, many of you maybe have heard about her, Ananda Maima. So she's actually our most recent one, so we actually have a photograph of her. She was born in Bengal, what is now Bangladesh, and she lived most of her life in Bengal and in India. And she was from the Hindu tradition. She was born in the Hindu tradition, but she had very little regard for the rules of the time, because back then in India there was this very strict caste system, for example, where according to the caste of her family, which was the Brahmin caste, she should only associate with and touch people from the same caste, and definitely she was not allowed to associate with Muslims, for example, and so on. But she totally disregarded this advice. And even as she was a little girl, she was already fascinated by also the Muslim communities, which were also in the area where she lived. And she was fascinated also by some Christian missionaries that were visiting there in India, which was also very beautiful, considering that, I mean, most people back then understandably were not so happy about the invasion of these Christian people, mostly from England, who tried to convert from their own religions. But she came and she was eager to find their particular approach in their spiritual way. And because of this, she had to go through many ablutions from her mother, who had to wash her every time from associating with these heathens. But she didn't care, because for her somehow all of them were following the same path and had the same love of God. This has been characteristic to her life, that she was giving advice to people from very, very different religions. And she, even though she was illiterate, so she never read any books, somehow she managed to have a very intimate knowledge of all of these spiritual traditions, and something you might even call paranormal, how she managed to gain all this knowledge without ever reading anything. And she could always talk to people in their own language, whether it was a Christian person that she would talk in terms of Jesus and Virgin Mary, for example, or the Muslim ones or the Hindu ones, and she was just kind of equally present with all of them. Ananda Mai means bliss permeated, and Ma means mother, so she was a bliss permeated mother, and it's something very characteristic to her, that she was always in this state of bliss and ecstasy, and she was traveling for most of her life, just somehow following what she felt the need, and there were hordes and hordes of devotees that flocked to hear her words and her teachings. Then we have Catherine of Siena, so Siena obviously being in Italy, in the 14th century, and she was from the Christian, the Catholic tradition. She had a relatively short life. She died at the age of 33, like Jesus did. And she was a very unusual little girl. She was already at age 6 having visions of Jesus, and when she was 7 years old, she tried to run away to the desert, which she didn't find the desert just outside the walls of Siena, because she heard about saints living in the desert, and she tried to do the same, so she ran out and found herself a cave where she aimed to pray all night, until she tells the story that she had in the night a vision of God who told her, it's too early for you, you're already 7 years old, so better go back to bed. It's said that miraculously she found herself back in her bed after she had this vision, and then she wanted to find out whether it really happened, because maybe she had a dream. And her older brother went to find the cave where she was, and indeed when he reached the cave, he found a little cross that she'd made out of some twigs and a loaf of bread which she put there in the cave because she decided that she would fast for as long as she could, and she had the loaf of bread ready just in case she couldn't manage anymore. So it was somehow a miraculous story from her childhood. And she refused marriage from a young age, which caused her many trials and torments, because everyone wanted her to get married. In the end, she cut off her hair so she would not be attracted anymore to a future husband. And in the end, her family gave up and let her just pursue a life of devotion and actually of service to the poor. And one of the remarkable things about her life, considering she was so young, is in the last 2 years of her life, which means we're talking about when she was in her late 20s and early 30s, she became an ambassador for the Pope. So she was getting involved in some very high-level politics at the time when there was what was called the Great Schism. So it was when there became 2 popes, and one was in Avignon and there was one in Rome, and there was a big kind of conflict and finding out who was the Pope. She was actually getting involved with this and aiming to try to bring peace at this time, which is something quite remarkable for somebody so young. In this picture, she looks rather demure, but actually she was quite a feisty character, we could say, and somehow I feel it doesn't really represent the let's say the vivacity of her life, which comes through in her poetry and her writings. Then we have Lala Laleshwari. Again, we're in the 14th century, this time in Kashmir. It's very difficult to put her in a particular religion or spiritual tradition. It's put here Kashmir Shaivism / Sufism. She actually embodies, because there are also some Hindu aspects. Definitely some of her teachers were Sufi, and in her writings we see much of also Kashmir Shaivism, so she was merging many of these paths and traditions in her life. She's famous for wandering around completely naked, as you can see in this artistic representation of Lala. Lala means darling, so she was considered the darling of Kashmir, and she was much loved despite her completely unconventional approach to life. She escaped what was quite an abusive marriage when she was young, in her early 20s, and then after that she just became this wandering mystic, and was completely naked and singing songs of devotion, and she was equally mocked by people and by children because she had such a funny appearance. And also loved by many as well. So she was an extremely eccentric and unusual character, and described by many as what we might call a divine mad woman. So one of these people that were so crazy in their state of devotion and love that they appeared to the world as being a little bit crazy, but somehow coming from this zeal in their heart for the spiritual path. Then, this is the only artistic representation I could find of Rabia al-Basri, who was in the 1st century in what is now Iraq, Mesopotamia it was back then. So she was a Sufi mystic. Sufism, by the way, coming from Islam, for those of you that don't know, but it's a more radical, we could say, form of Islam in the sense that it's very liberal and free from the rules and conventions and traditions that surrounds much of the Muslim tradition. It's one where they were following the call of the heart and above all the state of love, and thus the Sufis were and are again extremely unconventional, and so living this life of inner freedom. Rabia came from a very poor background, and she was sold into slavery when she was quite young. Many accounts say that she actually was forced into prostitution, so she was a prostitute for much of her life, and also doing many menial jobs and as a slave. He said that she was freed from slavery because even while she was working all day, in the night when she wasn't working, she was continuously praying. And one day her master heard her praying and found her apparently bathed in light. And even hearing her prayers and her ardent desire just to be with God, he said that he couldn't keep her anymore in his service and that he had to free her. So he set her free. And after this time, she lived in a very humble house and with very, very few possessions, and simply lived this life of devotion and prayer, and also with many, many people coming to her to seek her advice and her counsel. Sarada Devi is from the Hinduism tradition, the Hindu tradition. Sarada Devi is mostly known as the wife of the great saint Ramakrishna. Some of you maybe have heard of Ramakrishna. She actually was married to him when she was only 6 years old, which was the convention at that time, that young girls, they were married so young, but then she lived with her family until she came of age, so to speak. However, this marriage, they say it was never consummated, and actually she became his first disciple, Ramakrishna's first disciple. So she learned a great deal from him, but then she became, you could say, a spiritual master or a saint in her own right, especially after his death, because she outlived him by a long time. And she was considered a little bit like Anandamayi, who I just showed you earlier. She was considered as a mother to all those on the spiritual path. And again, many came to her to look for advice, and it's something which is common to all the saints, that people were very, very drawn to them and wanted to be with them all the time. Teresa of Avila, from the 16th century in Spain. She's another very famous saint. She's famous for entering into states of ecstasy, and even there's a very controversial statue of her in the Vatican in Rome, in which she looks like she's almost in an orgasmic state because she's so much in this ecstasy, you could say, of communion with God. She, again, from a very, very young age, she was dedicated to the spiritual life and was. She wanted to enter a convent at the first possible opportunity. She did run away from home, just like Catherine, when she was very young. She wanted to become a martyr, like the saints, and she tried to run away to become a martyr. She wanted to get her head chopped off by some heathens and be a martyr. This was her plan. It failed. She was found by her parents and dragged back home. But it showed this young heart that was just yearning, we could say, for the spiritual path. And then she actually lived to a very old age. She was responsible for a great reform of the church, which had become very institutionalized at that time, and again following more kind of rules and rigid ways of being. And she actually reformed a part of the church and had a great deal of followers. That again, their main quest was this state of devotion and love, and not getting caught up in all the bureaucracy and rules that surrounded religion at that time. And even back then there was a lot of corruption in the church and people accepting bribes and all kinds of things. So she kind of wanted to completely abolish all of that in the institutions which she formed, because she founded many convents. Again, she was not your usual Catholic practitioner. She was investigated by the Spanish Inquisition, which was at that time due to the experiences which she described and the states of ecstasy which she had. And of course, those priests who were very serious, as she describes them, they had not reached such an elevated spiritual state as her, and therefore could not understand it, and thus she was disbelieved for a lot of her life about her experiences and investigated by the Spanish Inquisition. But even they, after a while, had to let go of their case because somehow it's this state of authenticity which shines through her writings and her works. That once you read her books, it's very hard not to be completely convinced by her because it's so genuine and humble and also shy somehow the way she relates her experiences, that it's so clearly something that comes directly from her heart. And the last one that we will speak about, Yeshe Zogyal, who again was from the 1st century and lived in Tibet. Yeshe was a princess. She was born as a princess, but did not want to follow the norms of the social status that she had. She didn't want to get married. It's a common theme amongst these days. And I have to say that this is not wanting to get married. It's not wanting to fall into the conventional patterns, we could say, of life and to get stuck in a situation where they would not be able to pursue their spiritual practice. However, after a lot of trials of different suitors coming to meet her, because she was extraordinarily beautiful and extremely special, even from childhood, so many men with a very high status wanted to marry her. She went through many trials and ran away from some different suitors. In the end, she was actually married to the king of Tibet, who finally took her as his bride. But very soon after that, the king was visited by the great Tibetan master Padmasambhava, who was considered a Buddha at that time in the tradition of Tantric Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism. And the king was so impressed by Padmasambhava that he offered him many gifts, including his wife, Yeshe. And you could say that was the hand of God that allowed her to go off with Padmasambhava. The king, he had other wives, of course, at that time he had many wives, so for him it was not a big thing somehow to give her away. And she became the consort of Padmasambhava. So this is the Tantric Tibetan path. So actually she became his consort, and which means she was engaged in Tantric or lovemaking and this kind of spiritual practice with him, and he initiated her in the spiritual path. And after, she became a teacher in her own right. And it is considered in the Tibetan Tantric tradition that she achieved the same level as Padmasambhava, which was what they call the state of Buddhahood. So it said that she reached also that level, and she was, again, living a very interesting life. In some parts of her life, she traveled, living with very few possessions, and also offering her teachings once she attained a very high spiritual level. So that's a very brief synopsis of the lives of the saints. And now we'll go into some more details, and we'll pick out some other stories and aspects of their life. So I'll turn this off now. So, as you might already have gathered from the description of their lives, very brief one, something that all of these saints have in common is an extremely unconventional approach to spirituality. And this is something I wanted to underline because it's very important in terms of the fact that I believe all of them are of the belief that when we get too much bound in dogmas and kind of rigid beliefs, then it somehow detracts us from the heart, which is the one which is yearning and full of love, which is a necessity, you could say, on the spiritual path, to have this heart filled with love and devotion, and to follow the impulse of the heart, rather than getting caught up in all the rules and regulations of traditional spirituality. So these women did not fit into any specific boxes. Another aspect which is very common to them is that they were completely abandoned, we could say, to what we could call the divine will. So following completely the universal principles and what was the most integrated, we could say, for them in their lives, and just offering themselves completely to all those who came into their path and who they felt needed their help. So this lack of convention, it's shown, I guess, probably say the most in Lala Laleshwari. If you remember, she was the naked saint in Kashmir who, once she left her husband and her husband's family that were very mean, we could say, to her, and she did suffer a lot from them, and she had the courage to run away from that life, and in that same time she discarded her clothes and she became a wandering mystic. And there are some funny stories about this and about her nakedness. And one of the stories said that she said that the reason she was wandering naked was that she had nothing to hide, since she had never met a real man. And she said this because, from her perspective, a real man is someone who was completely at one with Shiva, and Shiva being the masculine consciousness. And there's a beautiful story that she was wandering around naked until she encountered a Sufi master whose name was Ali Hamadani, and actually became one of her teachers. And he said that when she saw him, she instantly ran into a baker's shop that was just next to her, and she jumped in the oven. And she said that she jumped in the oven to hide her nakedness. She came out actually of the oven, despite the fact that the oven was lit. She came out completely unscathed and actually then clothed in a very beautiful costume. And she said that finally, for the first time in her life, she saw a man because he was so spiritually realized, and thus she decided she needed to cover herself. So this is a very funny story from Lala's life. And she wrote a very beautiful poem about this. I'll read it to you, about her nakedness, where she says, "Dance, Lala, with nothing on but air. Sing, Lala, wearing the sky. Look at this glowing day. What clothes could be so beautiful or more sacred?" So it shows this beautiful state of inner freedom that she had, and free from limitations, and as it's completely exemplified by her freedom even from her clothes. Now the saint Anandamayi Ma from India, the one that was living mostly in the 19th century, she lived a very, very unconventional life. Even though she was married at an extremely young age, her husband soon discovered that she would not be a conventional wife. And we're talking at the time that she was born, and it's a very traditional society where wives were expected to fulfill many different duties, and also would not be able to do anything without the permission of their husbands, plus women would not be able to wander around alone. Yeah, so this was kind of the rules at that time. But she was very fiery, and it is said that the first time that her husband, who was called Bolanat, he tried to approach her in the marriage bed, that he was kind of electrocuted when he tried to touch her, because she was not interested at all in those kind of marital relations. And actually he became her disciple eventually. One thing that's very interesting in the life of Anandamayi Ma is that she was so humble that she apparently did aim to fulfill as much as she could her traditional duties as a wife and so on. So she was cooking for him, she was doing her household chores. For a long time she also was looking after his family, and she was working very, very hard for this. And actually, even later when she became a very revered spiritual teacher with many, many followers, still she always asked his permission to do anything, as a wife had to at that time. So she always came to him and asked him for permission. You know, I want to go to this place, until he died actually a long time before her. Now, she kind of made it clear when she asked him that there was no chance that he'd say no. But still, she asked him. But at the same time, she was completely unconventional when it came to following, you know, the traditional path. He was very liberal. He understood she was a very special being, and he allowed this to happen, allowed her to be visited by countless people, even men, which at the time it was very frowned upon, and he faced a lot of criticism from his peers because of everything that he allowed her to do. And even she appeared unveiled, which at the time it was not allowed for especially men to see women who did not have a veil on her face, but that he allowed her to remove the veil. So she freed herself also from that convention, you could say. And she was forever falling into these spiritual trances and states of ecstasy. Ecstasy, by the way, being common to all of them, all of the saints in different ways, and just being in this ecstatic state of love for God. And she was falling into trances, and it said that she was even burning sometimes the pots in the kitchen, because she would fall into a trance in the kitchen and forget all about the cooking. It happened just a few times. But then she would fall into these trances and would start dancing in the kirtans, those chanting songs, and she would start to dance and then fall to the floor and kind of exhibited this very unusual behavior. And at times it said that just mantras started to come out from her mouth and when she was in this ecstatic state. And because of this lack of convention, a lot of experts came to visit her and tried to exorcise demons from her, or tried to see if she was mentally ill, or like, looking into her in these different ways. So she kind of had to suffer all of this. And they all found that she had absolutely no mental illness, and every religious person that tried to exorcise the demons couldn't even approach her or come near her. It said they tried to come close, but there was something kind of invisible that was stopping them. So all of their attempts to free her from her strange behavior were completely unsuccessful. I already mentioned in a similar way how Saint Teresa was investigated by the Spanish Inquisition because she was falling into these states of ecstasy, and she described them in great detail and how it was an almost kind of erotic union that she had with Jesus and with God. And even she describes a moment in which she had a mystical wedding with Jesus. And actually also St. Catherine, who comes that she also had a similar experience. Her story is quite similar in this way. And thus, this was seen to be very strange and not normal for a woman and for a religious person. And so she was investigated very thoroughly, you could say, by the authorities at that time. And for a long period of time, she was accused of being possessed by the devil and all kinds of things because of her strange behavior. And again, she was constantly free from this and continued her path no matter what. And it's something that they all did, was that they were filled with such an ardent love. We could say that no matter what happened, they would continue their path despite all the opposition they had. There's a very beautiful poem which Saint Teresa wrote about all these priests that she was surrounded by, and who of course believed themselves to be her superior. And she wrote this very sweet poem. How did those priests ever get so serious and preach all that gloom? I don't think God tickled them yet. Beloved, hurry up, she says. And for me this is so sweet, that because it's something actually that they all have in common, is this state of happiness and freedom and love for God, and a very good sense of humor as well. Because, you know, we have this idea, I grew up with this idea that religion is something very boring and serious, and if you are serious on the path, then you will not be joking about or engaging with frivolous things. Something which is common to all of them is this great sense of humor, and happiness. And Saint Teresa, she also taught all those who followed her that happiness was an essential aspect of the spiritual path. So she was always saying, don't get gloomy or miserable. This is not the way to live. And if you imagine that at that time, Catholicism was something very, very serious, and even sitting in quite gloomy churches and people doing all kinds of practices to hurt themselves and fasting and everything, which actually she also did. So she did follow a lot of these ascetic practices, but always she was very cheerful and full of an amazing sense of humor. So this was something very beautiful in the life of Saint Teresa. And Catherine of Siena, as I already mentioned, she cut her hair off when her family tried to get her to be married. And actually, because of this, she suffered a lot, because they tried to force her into marriage a long time after, and she was made the servant of her house, even though she was the daughter, but they made her into a servant to try to force her to change her mind, but she never did. And again, her poetry that she writes is full of this state of love. And actually, she also described, like Saint Teresa, this marriage with Christ as something extremely unusual. In her account, is that she says that the wedding ring that she received was made from Jesus' foreskin, which is something very unusual, especially imagine for a young woman who was a religious woman, that she came with this idea, and that's what she said and what she described happened in this mystical experience. But something which has been erased from many Catholic accounts of her life. And actually this is something which is common in all the kind of religions who embraced to a certain extent these saints, but very often they omit some of the more unconventional aspects from their life, probably because they didn't really have a way to explain it. So some of these details you have to hunt for them, because you will not find them if you look at the Catholic lives of the saints and so on. So she had this very, very unusual way to relate to the spiritual path. Now, even though there are three who got married. So Anandamayi and Sarada Devi, who were both from India, and they lived in a kind of similar period. As I mentioned, they were put in arranged marriages when they were very young. But they had a far from conventional approach, you could say, to these marriages, and both following a very, very religious and spiritual path. I mentioned earlier about this state of divine madness, which animated especially Lala Laleshwari, and she wandered the world singing songs and being completely naked. But this is something which you could say, this complete zeal and devotion, this ardent love which animated these women's hearts, that again this led them to, you could say, love God above all else. So they didn't really care about how they appeared, how they looked, what people thought of them, because this was somehow the driving force of their life. And I mentioned, for example, that Rabia, who was this Sufi mystic, even when she was a slave, she prayed all night, and this is something common with all of the saints, that they were engaged in spiritual practices constantly, and even in the night. And Anandamayi Ma's husband, Bholanath, in India, he tried to force, in the beginning, Anandamayi Ma to share the beds with him. It was normal that they sleep together, and she refused. He stayed in the bed and she just slept on the floor. And he was woken up in the night sometimes because she was actually spending the whole night performing different spiritual practices. So in her practice she was doing yoga, asanas, and reciting mantras and things like this. And he was completely astounded to discover her doing this. And it's actually said that at a certain point, because Anandamayi Ma initiated her husband in the spiritual practices, and at a certain point she used some pretext to get him out of the bed and to sleep on the floor, because she thought this would be much better for him instead of sleeping in the luxurious bed. So she got him to sleep on the floor, and then quickly she had people dismantle his bed, so he could no longer sleep in the bed, and somehow this was her kind of pushing him to break his attachments, like you said, to worldly life and worldly comfort. Again, considering the conventions of the time, this is something completely extraordinary for a woman to get her husband to sleep on the floor. So this is somehow showing this incredible initiating power that she had, and also his total respect and reverence for her as a spiritual teacher. There's also a beautiful story from the life of Yeshe Zogyal that in the kind of early phases of her spiritual life, and she was still living at home with her parents, and as I mentioned, she was a princess, and a lot of suitors were coming to try to seek her hand in marriage, and the family were trying to deal with this situation and also to deal with her, who was saying, on my deathbed will I marry, because she wanted to pursue the path to reach enlightenment and not to get caught up in the world. And it said that finally the family accepted two main suitors who were princes, who were very high-level people, and they were both waiting outside the house, and they said that the first one to take her hand would be the one that would marry her. And she was forced into this. She was dressed up in finery and so on, and forced to go out, and one of them reached her first. And then they said that something miraculous happened, that she stuck her feet into a boulder, and she got stuck in the boulder like a rock. So they tried to pull her, and none of them could move her, as if she would be a mountain. And she said, I refuse to follow you. But these men were extremely cruel, and they said they actually stripped her of her clothes and started to beat her and whip her and to subject her to this horrible abuse, to the point where she was in so much pain that eventually she had to follow them. But she withstood it, it is said, to a great, great extent, and saying to them, it doesn't matter about this body, because I'm more than the body, and I will seek the state of enlightenment. But eventually she had to follow them. But in the night, when they were asleep, she ran away, and for quite a long time she lived in the wilderness, living just off fruits, until finally she was discovered, and eventually, as I mentioned before, she was married to the king of Tibet, which was an extremely fortunate thing for her, because then she could be gifted to her master, Padma Shambhava. But again, she had this total craziness that most women at that time would have just followed what would be the norm in order to avoid all the trouble which she had to go through. This love of God is very beautifully illustrated by Sarada Devi, and I will read you a quotation from her. She says, as you smell the fragrance of a flower by handling it, or the smell of sandalwood by rubbing it against a stone, so you obtain spiritual awakening by constantly thinking of God. So very beautifully illustrating how all of these women had this one goal in their life, which was seeking this union with God and being constantly with Him. Even once they attained this very beautiful state, they constantly lived this throughout their life. Now, something which is, we could say, more controversial in the spiritual path of these women, in fact, in most of them, is that we can say that the way that they related to the spiritual path and to God was highly erotic. And that's something which is, again, being kind of glossed over by many of the religions who hold them in great esteem. And even, as I mentioned, for example, this statue which is in the Vatican of Saint Teresa of Avila is very controversial, and many said it should be cast out of the Vatican because it looks so erotic. But this is something which is very interesting in their lives, that they had this approach which was like they viewed God as their ultimate lover, and they had this very intimate relationship with God, and it turns into this kind of ecstatic desire to merge and to unite which becomes, in a way, we could say, this mystical type of fusion or even lovemaking. And it's something which I find extremely beautiful in their writings, how they just wanted to completely unite with God, and in this way of almost desiring absolutely nothing else. I can read you a very interesting poem also from Saint Teresa. I'm dotting these poems in because I find them very inspiring, and I hope you also do. So she writes of God like this: "When he touches me, I clutch the sky's sheets, the way other lovers do, the earth's weave of clay. Any real ecstasy is a sign you are moving in the right direction. Don't let any prude tell you otherwise." And this is something I love in her writings, and in also many of the others, is this state of being completely without inhibitions and without shame, and this just desire to fall in the ecstasy of love. And again, this is something which got her into so much trouble, because at that time it wasn't considered that a state of ecstasy was a very appropriate thing in religion, which is ironic considering, as she says in the poem, the state of ecstasy was a sign of success on the spiritual path. It shows that they were moving in the right direction. But of course it was considered quite unconventional. And similarly, in the life of Rabia al-Basri, the Sufi mystic, the Muslim tradition has kind of glossed over and erased this aspect of her poetry, which is has this erotic nuance, many of her poems. For example, she says, again speaking of God, and actually describing this state of mystical union: "One day he did not leave after kissing me." And something I find so beautiful is this completely intimate relationship that she has with God, that she describes that he even kissed her. And after this very beautiful kiss, they stayed always united. And I'll read you also one from Saint Catherine. "I won't take no for an answer," God began to say to me, when he opened his arms each night, wanting us to dance. And this dance of love is also, it's a recurrent theme if you read poetry of these women, is this idea that this ecstatic love for God was a sublime dance. And even though she was, again, a Catholic, so that's something very unusual in the Catholic tradition. If you look into the Sufi tradition, for example, that's something quite common, because the Sufi mystics were often seen singing and dancing and kind of engaging in this spiritual dance of love. But in the Catholic tradition, that was something considered completely inappropriate, especially for somebody living a religious life. But this is how she related to her experiences with God. And that also is a very beautiful sign to me, that these experiences which these women had, that in their essence they were all the same. So even though they came from different paths, that state of mystical union with God is something which was the same for all of them, because they described them in very similar terms, despite being from very different backgrounds and time periods. Lala Vishvari describes in her poetry this mystical love-making between Shiva and Shakti, which is something very specific to the Tantric tradition, and how the whole universe is sustained by this love-making between the divine masculine and divine feminine, Shiva and Shakti. And she speaks of this love-making as something that inspires her heart very much. And she says, "I, Lala, entered the jasmine garden where Shiva and Shakti were making love. I dissolved into them and we became one. What is this to me now? I seem to be here, but really I am walking in the jasmine garden." so her heart was somehow so beautifully animated by this beautiful, you could say, play between the divine masculine and feminine. And in the case of Yeshe Zogyal, this fusion was happening literally in her case because her spiritual practice was involving the tantric fusions, the tantric lovemaking, and she describes in her writings how she offered her yoni, or her most intimate parts, to Padma Shambhava as an offering. So it's something very intimate and very beautiful, and how she reached these very mystical and elevated states even through tantric lovemaking. And through this she gained bit by bit the state of enlightenment. And even at some point Padma Shambhava told her, you've learnt as much as you can from me for now, and now you need to go out and find yourself a consort. So he sent her out to find a very specific man. He already told her who he was and how he would recognize him by his appearance. And she had to set out and find this man to become her lover, and also to initiate him, and thus to somehow deepen the teachings. And actually it's a very beautiful story about this journey a very long journey which she undertook to find this man who was to become her lover. He sent her out with some gold dust, which he said she would need when she would meet him. And that was pretty much all she had, just the clothes she was wearing, and this. It was said that she had a begging bowl which was filled with gold dust that she went out with. And on the way, she met some robbers who, of course, would take that precious bowl that she was carrying. And she dealt with these robbers in a very unusual way. She started to sing to them. So she started to sing beautiful songs. And he said that all of the robbers, through her songs, entered in a state of samadhi, or in this state of divine ecstasy or nirvana, through the songs that she was singing to them. So this was a very beautiful story, and afterwards they became completely converted and wanted to become her followers and for her to be her teacher, and to be their teacher. And she said, I'm really sorry, but I have a mission here. So she continued on her way, but after she profoundly touched the lives of these men who were, the outset might have killed her and definitely would have stolen the gold that she was carrying. And she did meet the man who she was intended to meet. She found him in a market and discovered that actually he was a servant in a household. And at that time, the servants, they were kind of owned by the household, so it's not like she could say, oh, please come with me, and he could do whatever he wanted. So she had to go to the household and convince the owners to let him go. And they were very attached to him, actually. He was very much loved in the house. So they said no. But she insisted again and again and said, okay, name your price, and I will pay whatever you ask for. They said, there's no way you can pay the price you ask for. That bowl of gold dust is not nearly enough for what he's worth. And they named a very, very high sum. Now, at this time she went away and she said, okay, somehow she's going to find this money to buy this man off the household. And it said that she found along the way, or she heard about a family a rich family, who just lost their son. He died, and he was wounded and killed. And they were so completely devastated by this loss. And she went to them and she said, I can bring your son back to life. And so I will do this for you if you will ransom this man that I need to procure from this family, and if you pay for him to be released. And they said, yes, anything we will do if you bring him back to life. And according to the story, she actually did manage through some yogi techniques. She managed to bring life back into the corpse, and he actually got up, and he was completely well. And after this, they paid for the man to be released, and he became her lover and her consort. So it's a very beautiful story from her life. And also, again, showing this very unusual approach to the spiritual path, but her kind of complete desire to do anything to achieve what was leading on the path, that she got herself into all these very interesting situations. Now, all of these women in different ways, they endured quite a lot of hardships. I described already some of them. So this is something which was common to all their lives, and it's, I could say, shows us that on the spiritual path that nothing is kind of handed over so easily, and they had to go through different trials in their lifetime, like Saint Teresa being investigated by the Inquisition, and Saint Catherine being made a servant in her household, and all the things that she had to go through with being whipped and tormented until she finally met her master. Lala Laleshvari also being very highly mistreated by the family she lived with. They said that the family would put a stone on her plate and then cover it with rice, so it would look like she was given a normal sized portion, but actually it was much less. And also her husband severely mistreated her. But there is also another very sweet story from her life that she used to go and she had to go and collect water from the river for her husband and for the family. And but she liked to go and meditate by the river, so she would seek this opportunity when she would go to the river and she would sit and meditate. And her husband was not happy because she took a long time to come back with the water, and one day he followed her to see what she was doing, and he saw her meditating by the river, and he was extremely upset by this. And as she was walking back with this earthen pot on her head, as she was carrying the water, he says that he took a stone and he threw it at the pot, so it broke in many pieces. And the story goes that miraculously, although the pot broke, the water stayed on her head in a big column, so he was witnessing this miracle. And then she went into the house and she tried to fill up all the water pitchers in the house, which she did, but still there was so much water that she still had this water on her head. And in the end, she emptied the water on her head into the fields next to the house, and it formed a lake. And this lake is said to still exist. There is a lake in Kashmir, which is called Lala's Lake, and this is the story behind the lake, that it happened. And due to, I believe the story is told like this, due to somehow the complete love for the spiritual path, which led her to do so many things which defied the rules of her family, and thus she was rewarded by this very beautiful miracle. But despite the hardships that these women had to endure, something which is common to all of them is this state of happiness which is constantly radiating from them, and this is due to the peace and the solace which they found somehow in the love of God and the state of unity and peace and this total state of devotion. It's most obviously exemplified by Anandamayi Ma. Even her name, Anandamayi Ma, is the bliss-permeated mother, and she was constantly in this state of bliss. And you can look up photos of her because there are very many. It's one of the beautiful things with this saint, because she lived so recently and had so many followers. She was very famous. There are many photos of her, and you can enter in an ecstatic state just looking at those photos, because her face is just radiating this state of bliss and happiness, and it obviously was something very attractive in her that drew thousands to her, because she just constantly had this glowing face filled with bliss. One of the reasons why these spiritual women managed to maintain a state of happiness was because they were very detached from what we might consider something good and something bad, because they had to undergo a lot of difficulties in their life and a lot of beautiful things, and somehow they looked at these equally, and they remained detached from that, which helped them to stay in this state of happiness. And Yeshe describes this in a very nice way. She says, "Since everything is but an apparition, having nothing to do with good or bad, acceptance or rejection, one may as well burst out in laughter." Somehow showing this equanimity in front of good or bad. And there's also a beautiful story from the life of Lala, that some children were throwing stones at her, laughing at her because she was naked. And there was a cloth merchant nearby who started to shout at the children and tell them off because he held Lala in great reverence, and he told them off for mocking her. And she said, just leave them, don't be so tough on those children, it doesn't matter. And to prove her point, she asked him for 2 pieces of cloth of an equal length, an equal size. And she put one piece over one shoulder and one piece over the other shoulder. And she went about her day. And every time she was mocked by someone, she tied a knot in one of the pieces of cloth. Whenever she was praised by someone, she tied a knot in the other piece of cloth. So she had kind of knots on one side and knots on the other side. And she went back to the cloth merchant and she said, look, can you please weigh these pieces of cloth and tell me which is the heaviest? And of course they were exactly the same weight because it was 2 identical pieces of cloth. And she said, look, no matter how many knots this cloth has, it still weighs the same. So thus she was kind of proving the point that no matter if we are mocked or we are abused or if we are praised, then still it's the same from the ultimate spiritual perspective, because somehow resting in this state of divine happiness, it's beyond all the conflicts in the world. So the last things that I want to mention about these saints is that all of them manifested an exemplary state of courage. And this is something very beautiful, because having to face a lot of difficulties, they nonetheless had a great deal of courage. And one of the characteristics of all of these women is that they manifested a great courage also in front of men, because all of them lived in a society where women were considered inferior to men. That's something in every single one of their lives. And not that I want this to become like a feminist manifesto or something, but still, considering the situations that they were in their lifetimes, they manifested a huge courage to still follow their path without any compromise. And even their approach to men was without compromise. And I already mentioned, for example, how Ananda Maimar, despite what was expected of her as a wife, she did never compromise on the spiritual principles, and even actually due to her love for her husband, she wanted to initiate him in the spiritual path, and thus actually forced him to do a lot of things which were hard and tough, because it was, according to her, for his spiritual evolution. When you read, if you would ever read the autobiography of Saint Teresa of Avila, actually this book was written by her on the request of those who were investigating her in the Spanish Inquisition, because they wanted to read the account of her life to try to examine whether it was real or not, whether it was authentic or whether she was lying about her experiences. So she never intended to write an autobiography for other people to read. It was actually for them that she was writing this autobiography, in which she describes her life and all her experiences in an incredibly candid, pure and humble way, to the point where they were actually convinced, as I mentioned, that it was completely authentic. But one thing that's very interesting in this book is, while at the same time she's saying very humbly, of course, how could I know as a woman, as a humble woman, what are the realities of these spiritual states? Still, this is what God told me, or this is what I experienced from God. And she always she puts herself down in a way in these terms, like accepting the position that she had in the society at that time, but at the same time, she teaches these guys through her words, which, imagine, it's the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, she could be burnt at the stake at that time if they found her to be guilty. And yet she talks to them in the book, and she says, well, you who are reading this book, you would do well to mark my words, that you should follow this form of prayer and to put all your heart and your faith in God instead of pursuing all the things that you're pursuing. And like investigating all these people to decide if they are properly religious or not. And it shows such an incredible state of courage that she did this, and coming from this trust in her path, we could say, and also again a state of equanimity in front of death, because she could easily have lost her life if they found her to be guilty. Also, something, as I mentioned before, is incredible in the life of Catherine of Siena, is that she got involved in politics. And imagine at that time in the 14th century in Europe, a woman getting involved in high-level politics would be considered completely out of the ordinary. And at a time when the Pope, he was in Avignon, she wrote him a lot of letters to persuade him to come back to Rome, and she actually apparently was instrumental in getting him to come back, and he trusted her so much that she became his ambassador, and he was sending her to talk with other important people on his behalf. So imagine that such a state of courage she had to, if she disagreed with something that was happening, even the Pope was doing, she was writing him some extremely fiery letters. And these letters still survive, so you can actually still read them. And it's quite amazing that she was prepared to do this at the tender age of 28, 29 years old. So, yeah, this is very, very interesting. But this state of courage is illustrated also in their writing. And Sarada Devi actually writes this, that even the impossible becomes possible through devotion. So through this state of devotion, they believed anything could happen, and thus they had a complete state of trust and courage. And because of this complete dedication, you could say, to the path, they became great initiators, and for both men and women that flocked to see them, and thus we could say that they truly were examples of what, from a tantric viewpoint, we call women who have obtained the Shakti state, meaning that they were completely fused with the divine feminine, and thus attracting many around because they just emanated a state of wisdom. And even, for example, Anandamayi Ma and Sarada Devi, they were worshipped as being, say, incarnations of the divine mother. And Sarada Devi says, "I am the mother of the wicked, as I am the mother of the virtuous. Never fear. When you are in distress, say to yourself, I have a mother." And something very beautiful for me, how she was completely somehow identifying herself with the Divine Mother, and thus offering this love and compassion to all those who came to her. And even though, again, these were women who at that time had an inferior status in society, men flocked to their sides as well as women. So this is something which is very beautiful, that they were extremely respected also by men, and many men came to seek advice and to ask for help and guidance on the spiritual path.
Yeah, in a sense, women have more freedom today, but on the other hand, when it comes to this kind of what we would describe as spiritual masters, we live in a climate which is not very receptive to that, actually, because
even the idea of having a spiritual master, whether it be a man or a woman, as a kind of spiritual authority, is something people find quite difficult, and especially mostly as a general rule, people tend to be hopping from different, this class and that class, and trying this and trying that. So I don't know if it's an easier climate, let's say, for such a spiritual woman. But yeah, I actually haven't come across anyone who is completely contemporary with us that I know of. They don't exist, of course. But it is true that in the case of many saints, and this is true for both men and women actually, that their fame increases after their death. Having said that, as I mentioned, these women did attract a lot of people around them, but it depends on which one, because, for example, in the case of Anandamayi Ma in India, she became very famous because also people from the West went to her, and thus she kind of got known outside of India, and that has a lot to do with the yogi Yogananda. I don't know if you heard about him, but he wrote this famous book, Autobiography of a Yogi, in which he talks about her, Ananda Maimana, because he actually met her. And then she became famous and everyone wanted to meet her from the West as well. But generally, yeah, it tends to be the case that people are known about. I mean, there is the case of Mother Teresa, for example, who is almost contemporary with us. She didn't die that long ago. And she was pretty well known also in her lifetime. But as for a current one, I don't know. But if you come across one, let me know. Well, it really depends who you ask what the definition of a saint is, because in kind of the common language, someone can be described as a saint just because they are living a pure or religious life or something like that. So that's why in the beginning I kind of gave you what I define as a saint, which would be somebody who has walked the spiritual path all the way to enlightenment or to the state of unity with God. So attained, we could say, what we would call the state of perfection, spiritual perfection, in their lifetime. And this is what I would describe as a saint, and it's in connection with the yoga system. We can say that someone who lives at the level of Sahasrara, so the highest level, when it comes to the 7 chakras, which is reserved only for those who truly reach the state of spiritual perfection, that they live at that level. Not that, because even, anyone on the spiritual path can have access sometimes to those special spiritual experiences and spiritual states, but they were living at that level. That's how I would define them, a saint. Absolutely. This is something which is very beautiful to find out, that the paths will merge, because the experiences which they encounter, maybe they use a little bit different language to describe them because they come from a different cultural background, but you can feel from the way that they describe them that they are the same. And for example, from the Hindu point of view, or the even Tantric point of view, then people speak about the revelation of the self, or Atman, being the discovery of our true nature, and through this we can fuse with the ultimate nature of God. And the stages of self-revelation are described quite thoroughly, in the traditions of different texts of Hinduism, of Tantrism, of Kashmir Shaivism, for example. So that's all coming from the East. Now, if you read the works of Saint Teresa of Avila, who came from the Catholic point of view and definitely did not have any contact with any of those spiritual traditions, she describes the same process, which is very interesting because you don't hear someone in the Christian tradition speaking of self-realization or self-revelation, and indeed, she doesn't use that language, but she writes about what she calls the discovery of the interior castle, and she has a book which is called The Interior Castle, and she's speaking about what she calls the discovery of the soul. She calls it the soul, but it's, from the description, it's the same reality she's describing as the Supreme Self, Atman. And she describes this journey very beautifully, that she says, this journey to the heart of God, effectively. It's like you go into a castle which has many levels, and there's the outside of the castle, which is very, very dark. And this is where many people are living, on the outskirts, where they live in darkness, and there's many torments and trials and difficult things happening. And gradually we penetrate the castle little by little. And she describes all the different chambers of the castle, and they get gradually lighter and lighter as you approach the center. And it's described in very Christian terms. So she says, in the outer chambers there are still lots of devils and demons who are tempting you and drawing you away from the path, but then gradually as you get closer in, then you get happier and happier and lighter and lighter. And I'm describing it in very brief terms, but it's very precise how she describes the stages of spiritual evolution. And considering that she was someone, again, she was not educated, but she could be a theologian in the preciseness of her language and how she describes it. So, even if the language is Christian, it's described so similarly. Or Yeshe, who was in Tibet, and she's in this kind of crazy Tibetan world where it's full of colors and different deities and gods and goddesses and all kinds of things. But still, it's the same reality she's describing. So, this is the wonderful thing. It shows us that it doesn't matter which path we follow, they all go to the same place. And thus, what is beautiful is no matter what path we are on, we can draw inspiration from all the other paths. And that for me is something which I really learned in reading about saints in general, not just the female ones, is, I will be reading about a Sufi mystic and suddenly I feel like, calling the name of Allah because it's like you feel this love and devotion that they have, and or the Christian one and saying these prayers or practicing yoga postures or whatever it is, but because they are all going in the same direction. So yes. Largely not. Most of the time they didn't even describe themselves as a spiritual teacher or spiritual master, but people came to them anyway. So definitely, for example, the two Catholic ones, they were just nuns, from their point of view. Didn't see themselves as anything more. And Ananda, my ma, who gained such huge fame, because also being in a period of time, I mean, she died in the 1980s, so it was when communication was much, not like we have now with the internet, but still, it was much easier to find out across the world, so she gained a very big fame. But she always said she never asked to be a teacher. She didn't describe herself as a guru, as many did in India at that time. But simply, if people came to her, she was happy to help them. So as far as I'm aware, I don't think any of them sought that title or prestige, but it just came to them.
And compared to male saints of the same times, did they self-regard as saints?
It's quite similar, to be honest, when you read also the lives of the male ones. They have that in common. I mean, they have actually a lot in common because ultimately they were just walking a spiritual path, whether they were man or woman. So, most of the time they didn't set themselves up as spiritual teachers, just that they attracted people. But there are some exceptions because sometimes they felt called by this mission. For example, Yogananda, he said that he had a vision in which he was told that and also told by his guru, his teacher, he was told that he needs to go and found a spiritual school in America, and he set sail to America and he started a spiritual school there. And him and also Vivekananda, who was a disciple of Ramakrishna, they were responsible for bringing yoga to the West because they were sent there. They were, by their teachers and by their spiritual mission, they were sent to bring yoga to the West. So in that sense, they did set out to be teachers because that was the mission that they had. But I don't know if they would ever have called themselves a saint or a master. I really don't know. But I didn't hear about. Definitely, it's not something you hear where they're saying, "Yes, come to me, I'm a saint." And usually, the ones that did that, they were not really genuine. Yeah, thank you for bringing it up. They did also have a huge following of women. And for example, St. Teresa, she founded convents which were just for women, and one of the things she emphasized was this state of sisterhood amongst women, and she viewed this as something very important on the spiritual path. And it's beautifully something we also encourage here, with Shakti groups, bringing women together. But she said it's really important, and she had these communities of women and where she loved them and inspired them on the path, so she was very much, in a sense, guiding women. And they all had women devotees, and Ananda my ma had some women that were especially very close to her and even helped to look after her and so on. And there is also a story from the life of Sarada Devi, who is mostly known as the wife of Ramakrishna, but it's not truly fair because especially after his death, and she really became a teacher, a master in her own right, and many people were coming to her. But even when Vivekananda, who was Ramakrishna's disciple, he came back from the West, where he had been teaching, and he came with a horde of women, which he'd encountered there in America, who had, let's say, an easier status in society than women did in India at that time. And he came with them, and she received them with open arms, and it was quite a controversial thing at that time, because they came from the West, and at that time in India, it was considered that a religious woman would not welcome such people. And she did with open arms, and she helped them, and she taught them, and so on. So, yes, and also Yeshe Zogyal. She had many female followers and also friends. And there's another story from her life where she met another princess, because she was a princess, who was also consort of Padmasambhava, because Padmasambhava, this master, he actually had many lovers and was initiating them. Yeshe was kind of the closest one, we could say. But also he had another one who's also quite famous in that tradition. She's called Princess Mandarava. And at this time when Yeshe, she was making this journey to find her consort, the story that I told you. Along the way, she met Princess Mandarava, who she'd never met before, because they were not at the same time with Padmasambhava, in the same place, I mean. And she relates the encounter with Princess Mandarava, and it's so beautiful because they were so happy to find each other, because they said, "Oh, we are both consorts of Padmasambhava, and we are both his disciples," and they were sharing spiritual stories and offering kind of advice to each other and sharing their spiritual paths and the techniques they've learned. And it's something very foreign to us in the West, the idea of two lovers of the same man being so happy to meet each other and to share kind of these spiritual things. But so, yeah, they had a big impact also on the lives of women, for sure. But again, I mean, they are not so known, most of them, so that's why I wanted to somehow bring out their lives a little bit. Because, yeah, historically, also because in many religions, unfortunately, it has been the case that women were not given the same place as men. And plus the fact that the way, as I mentioned before, the way they tended to relate to God, it was very unorthodox. And thus, it's very hard for the religious institutions to deal with that situation. Because they say, okay, they had many followers, they were revered, and obviously they reached a spiritual state, but what to do with all this kind of erotic poetry and unconventional behavior, and it's very hard for the religions to explain this, and thus you tend to find it's kind of pushed into the background, so yeah.
Yes. So it seems obvious that they had a lot of courage. Certainly they challenged the existing status quo. Departed from the norms. Is there a space for saints in normal daily life? Sorry, you just threw a picture.
No, but for sure. I mean, that's why I think they are an inspiration to us in that way. But also we live in society with norms and accepted and unaccepted types of behavior. Even if we think that we live in a world which is much more free, and in a sense it is, from some points of view, in that we are allowed to practice whatever religion or whatever that we want most of the time. And but even so, there are still very powerful social conventions and social norms in which following an extremely spiritual life is quite difficult within the confines of our society. I mean, especially one that's not very conventional. I mean, going to church once a week, it's okay. But dedicating your life to following a spiritual practice, which doesn't necessarily mean that we have to reabsorb ourselves from the world. I mean, we can live in the world and so on. But it's something that does take courage to do. I mean, even from the perspective of, I don't know, for example, one of the things that we teach in the school is the art of consecration, which means that before any action, we aim to become present and to offer that action to God. And imagine that means that before you do anything is the moment of closing the eyes and being silent and sitting. Well, even just that is something which people will be like, what are you doing? That's a bit weird, like, why are you doing that? And depending on your degree of courage and the determination to do that, then yeah, it's something which might not be accepted. Or for example, the Tantric path, which implies the awakening of eroticism and Tantric lovemaking. And that's something which is viewed by many as pretty weird or strange, or something that hasn't got anything to do with spirituality, because that's the Tantric way. It's just one way. I mean, there are many others. So I think that even within our society, still, if we want to really pursue the spiritual path, it does involve freeing ourselves from certain limitations imposed by society. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. Yes, many. I mean, I found these books just by searching, but each one of them have books written about them. Either they're autobiographies, in the case of Yeshis of Yen or Saint Teresa, for example, they're autobiographies, and otherwise there are biographies written about their lives, in the case of all of them, and then poetry, because most of them wrote poetry, and Lala, Rabia, Catherine, or Saint Teresa, Yeshe, they all wrote poetry, so you can discover them through their poems, and that's a beautiful practice in itself, is just opening a book and reading some poetry. Plus, some of them wrote books, and there are writings that they wrote, so there is quite a lot of material. It depends on each one, because some of them, there's a lot known about their life, and some of them there's very little, and it's more like mythology surrounding their life, because it's just stories that people handed down over generations. So, I mean, if you want, I can give you a book list. If you're actually curious to read, I can even send one to you after the talk. Yeah. Then I will make sure that you get the ones who are here, you get sent a little reading list. Yes, yeah. Okay, I might not get this 100% right, but from what I know, there is quite a severe process that goes on within at least within the Catholic Church. Now, when it comes to other denominations, I'm not really sure. But definitely there are some things that they have to go through. For example, they have to perform the miracle, and there has to be some kind of miracle that happened after they died, and usually it takes decades before they get that title of being a saint. But as for exactly how they decide it, I don't know, but there are many, many, many saints in the Christian tradition from their definition, so I'm definitely not in a position to tell you if they are all genuinely saints or not from the definition that I gave. I couldn't say, but they are people that lived a very holy life, of course, and did a lot of wonderful things in order to be recognized as saints. But I think each tradition has its own way to define what a saint is.
What made you drawn to these features, this character, and what is the bottom line?
I don't understand the question. Like, what do you mean by the bottom line? Like, what is it that unites them, or?
Yeah.
All of these saints,
Yes.
as opposed to other ones? I mean, I was drawn to them because their lives I found particularly inspiring. And also from the point of view of the spiritual path which I follow, which is the Tantric one, it draws, the Tantric path, for example, it draws on many other paths, we could say, in the way that it works. And for me, what drew me so much to all of these saints was this complete state of inner freedom they had, and this state of love and devotion which was somehow surpassing everything else, because that for me is beyond any specificity of a religion or a spiritual tradition. It's something which unites all of them, and the love of their path. Now, there could have been other saints that I could also have drawn in. These were just the ones that they somehow stood out to me as the most prominent from the different traditions, and also I didn't want to kind of have more of Christian or something, because there could have been other ones that I could have found. But they are also the saints about which the most is known, because I'm sure, there were many others that walked this planet and we just don't have records about them. But these are the ones that we do. So for me, they inspire me as role models, you could say, and I find that that's also why I wanted to do this meditation with you, because we can, even if we might say, okay, they are saints and they are far up there compared to where we are, we can emulate them, and we can try to feel the state which they had, because then this somehow pours into our life. So does that answer your question? I mean, there are many different spiritual paths, and it's true that at some point we need to choose the path which we are following, because if we try to just do a bit of this and a bit of that and be all over, then we will not make progress, because it's like you want to dig water for a well, and then you just make a lot of little holes and you will never reach the water, because even though it's the same water, eventually you still need to keep digging in the same place, otherwise you will not reach the water. So for me, that's why we have different spiritual paths, because also we have different affinities, and some paths are more appropriate for some people than others, and we need to find the one which is our heart is calling us towards. But ultimately, yes, they all reach the same place, and we find so many parallels between them. And in the Bible, there's a lot of, we could say, fundamental truths which are present there, which you will also find in, for example, the writings of Hinduism and Tantra, because they all describe the same reality, actually. It's just that sometimes the language is so different that it's not noticeable unless you kind of understand the esoteric aspects which are somehow hidden within the language. Then it becomes amazing how they all go in the same direction. And definitely, I would see Christianity as a completely valid spiritual path. It's just that many times it got so, let's say, diluted in institutions that the reality of the message and the aliveness of that path, it's often got a bit kind of diluted. But it's definitely a path which goes in the same direction as the others. Thank you very much for being such a wonderful audience. And I hope it was inspiring, and I hope that you feel inspired also to learn more, because, as I said in the beginning, I could have spent the weekend, talking about their lives and everything that they did and their teachings and practices, and there would be so much to talk about. It was actually quite a challenge to see how I could bring it into one talk. But it is something which is, I would say, a gift for the heart and the soul to read and discover the lives of saints in general, not just the female ones. And even many of them are on audiobooks, so if you're not much into reading, you can listen to the audiobooks even while you do something else. Life will be enriched. So thank you very much. See you